Welcome to Bloomberg Law. I'm Pacchia. Things may be about to get worse for the nation's largest law firms. That's according to a recent Citibank report. To discuss where the biggest firms are headed, we're joined today by Stephen J. Harper. He's a former partner at Chicago's Kirkland Ellis law firm, and he's currently an adjunct professor at Northwestern University School of Law. His forthcoming book is due out in April 2013, and it's entitled The Lawyer Bubble: Portrait of a Profession in Crisis. He's joining us, of course, from Chicago. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So the Citibank study is based on data from 176 firms, most of which are among the nation's 200 most profitable law firms. It found that while revenue grew at almost 3% in the second quarter, that was because of faster collections rather than an increase in new business. That's not good. Stephen, will the biggest firms ever be able to pull themselves out of this awful recession?
It's an interesting question, although there are a couple of interesting things about the Citicorp analysis that I think are worth at least noting. First, the one is that they're talking about it growing profits. In other words, the issue that they're concerned about, or that they're expressing concern about on behalf of the firms, is whether profits, which are already, frankly, for equity partners in big firms, astronomical, whether that profit growth will continue. So in an absolute sense, someone walking the street would look at this and say, well, wait a minute, average equity partner profits in the AmLaw 100 were $1.5 million last year compared to $300,000 in 1985. What's the real problem here? But the problem, and it is a problem, is that the revolution of rising expectations that is reflected in that kind of analysis does create, I think, potential for instability, particularly within some of these big firms. Where the glue that substitutes for culture, if you will, that holds a firm together is this year's K1 return, it can become pretty tenuous, and I think that's the real issue. And the trend is obviously, if you look at it in that respect, the trend is troubling, and it becomes even more troubling when you see that the way firms maintain or try to maintain their profitability is by continuing to squeeze everywhere else in the food chain in order to keep the people on top with the seven-figure incomes, which is why you saw, for example, no spring bonuses for associates this year for the vast majority of big law firms. But it's a real problem, but I think it's a problem that may actually go to the heart of the model in some ways.
Right. It's often said, no matter what your business, if you're not growing, you're shrinking. Citibank is projecting that the biggest law firms this year may be unable to match even 2011's anemic growth in profits, which at most firms was in the low single digits. If you were running an AmLaw 100 firm, what steps would you take to right the ship?
Well, it's an interesting hypothetical, and it'll never happen because I've been away from a big firm for the last several years. But there are a lot of things that I would do, but they would be longer-term considerations rather than trying to deal with quarterly estimates or quarterly projections, and they would be far more fundamental than trying to squeeze a little more out of the next quarter's bottom line. But they would go to the issue of whether or not you can get people to think a little bit longer term about what it means to be a lawyer in a law firm. The short-termism that's not unique to big law firms is widespread throughout our world right now, and it's not unique to lawyers. But the short-termism is ultimately an approach and an emphasis and a focus that's counterproductive to long-run instability. So if I were running a big law firm today, I'd think in completely different terms about what the goal ought to be in terms of next year, the year after, or 5 years down the road, as opposed to what am I going to do to make sure that next quarter's revenue and profit projections somehow return to double-digit growth. I think that would be, frankly, I think that's a fool's errand in the current climate.
Citibank is also reporting that expenses grew at 4% during the first half of 2012, driven mostly by increases in overhead costs like technology and healthcare. Is there anything firms can do to combat that problem short of yet another round of layoffs?
In terms of trying to deal with fixed costs like those, I'm not sure there's a lot that anybody can do about them. The question, I think, really for foresighted managing partners in large law firms is what is reasonable to expect in terms of a long-run profit that preserves the stability of the institution. And that may lead you to a much different series of steps and analyses and conclusions than trying to figure out
really
whether
hard.
there's it's extremely difficult, and it's extremely difficult in a world where, for example, lateral partner hiring has become the coin of the realm. I mean, that is the thing that all partners now, according to the most recent surveys of big law firm partners, their whole focus, the vast majority on them, is trying to recruit rainmaker lateral hires. Well, that comes at an extraordinarily high cost, or it can come at an extraordinarily high cost. Both in the situation where the rainmaker doesn't pan out, because it turns out that there's not really a good way to do the kind of due diligence that you would expect a law firm to do before taking one on, but it doesn't pan out now for a different reason, and that is the prospective lateral hire can't always get the information that he or she might like to have before deciding whether or not jumping to a different ship is actually a good idea or a bad idea. And I guess we could look most recently to Dewey and LaBeouf as a case study in the perils of excessive lateralism on both sides of that equation. Some of those partners are paying a dear price now for relatively recent lateral moves into that firm.
Sure, they're all stuck in bankruptcy court trying to figure out how much they're on the hook for.
That's right. Well, that's exactly right. And you forget, again, it's part of the revolution of rising expectations, but you forget, or I think sometimes law firm equity partners forget, that they are partners, in fact, in a business enterprise. There is risk, and although the downside risk until recently hasn't really reared its ugly head in the way that it has for many of the former partners at Dewey, it's there. And I think the more that you move towards a world of instability in some of these firms, the greater the magnitude of risk becomes.
Yeah. What do you think the right number would be, though, for a partner to be making in a big law firm to ensure the long-term viability of the practice?
Well, that's an interesting question. One way to look at it would be to say, if you ask these people, and by these people I mean my contemporaries who were in law school 30 or 35 years ago, what was the most that they ever expected to earn in the practice of law? I can tell you, I think very few of them would have given you a number that was higher than $500,000 a year. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the right number, but I think it's and as I say, it's a sort of a subjective assessment, and it's going to be different for different firms and different practices. And people will say, well, I'm willing to put up with this nonsense and this kind of work, for X amount, but if you want me to do this other kind of work that I find more distasteful, it's going to be there's going to be a premium to that. But I think most people would say you have a hard time explaining or defending why $1 million a year isn't enough. I don't know, but people tend to ratchet up their lifestyles, and they wind up with needs that. Or I should say perceived needs that make that number a non-starter for most firms. I mean, you need to look no further than last year's AmLaw rankings to see, where people's expectations wind up based upon, for example, those rankings. Last year, I think the average for the AmLaw 100 was $1.5 million. Fully recovered to pre-recession levels in ways that obviously many other professions and industries haven't.
If you'd like to learn more about the cases and issues we just discussed today, be sure to check out our offerings on BloombergLaw.com and also on the Bloomberg Terminal. You can follow our updates on Twitter, and you can see more of our videos, of course, on YouTube. I'm Pacchia. Thanks for watching.